Hello, I'm the Short Gal, and this is my show. This show is not just for short gals. That's right, I'm talking to you fellas, short or tall. The idea for this title is to use it as a metaphor, as I see being short a disadvantage in the society I live in today. But this podcast is not about stature. It's about conversations and sometimes monologues on how people have been able to overcome challenges. It's about society, leadership, and advice. Episode 8, Challenge. I want to learn a language as an adult. Thoughts from a Short Gal, an interview with Latin and German teacher and philologist, Bill Yanson. I love languages. If I had the time, I would probably be spending a large part of my day learning and perfecting language skills. I currently only speak 3 languages: my mother tongue Spanish, English, which I learned as a child and into my late teenage years, and like with anything, I'm still learning, of course, and French, which I learned after high school. I consider myself fully fluent in Spanish and English, but prefer to say that I am conversationally proficient in French and have an intermediate grammar level in the latter. I speak basic Portuguese and Italian, and I can say phrases in many other languages, but I do not state that I speak these languages. To me, in order to say that you speak a language, you have to be able to have a conversation in any situation, and that is not the case with these languages, as I only know phrases. I may not be the authority in language learning, but I do have a background in language teaching and translation. I got a certification of English proficiency from the University of Cambridge in England, and I taught English as a second language for more than 5 years. This was my part-time job through university until I left my hometown for Tampa, Florida. I began translating at that time as well, and I worked as a newspaper translator here in Florida in 2006-2007. So I have ample experience in this subject, and I consider it my fallback career in case everything else fails. I plan on having an episode dedicated entirely to translations, but for now, the current episode will focus only on language learning. Where do we start? The first thing I can say is that the best years to learn a new process is when you're a child. Notice that I didn't say a new language. See, when you're a child, your mind is so flexible that it will easily learn a new way to make connections. This is a time to teach your mind the power of abstract thinking in a new language without translation. The child will not confuse the languages he or she knows. This is the beauty of it. But let's face it, language learning in the United States is not encouraged and is taught too late. My guest Bill Yanson will talk about that in a moment. The benefits of learning a language are endless, and here I quote Business Insider. Quote, "Bilingualism provides benefits beyond the ability to ask for directions or to order a coffee without accidentally receiving a large dessert platter." What a happy accident though, right? The brains of polyglots operate differently than those of unilingual folk. Regular use of a second language sharpens many cognitive skills, and it's even been found to make you appear more attractive. End quote. I once read that some decades ago, the belief was that learning a new language confused you and your ability to think straight in one language. That has been proven wrong by latest scientific results. A Swedish study on neuroscience suggested that language learning makes your brain grow in the hippocampus and cerebral cortex areas. Those areas are involved in learning new material and spatial navigation. Need any more proof that a language enhances your mental capacity? Well, here are some benefits of language learning. Physical brain growth, as I mentioned a moment ago. Decision-making improves by detaching us from emotional thinking inherent in our own language. This makes us more rational thinkers. We are better at switching tasks. If your brain has to move from language to language fast, then it will move from activity to activity fast. Memory skills are better, and a great way to train your brain for your elderly years. You will develop a better attitude towards the cultures who speak the language, therefore removing some of the cultural biases and stereotypes one might have. You become more competitive and more attractive to employers. It boosts your creativity. When you look for words or ways of saying something to make yourself understood, you tap into an area of your brain that boosts your creativity. It's super fun to travel when you speak the language. It's a nice jolt of adrenaline and excitement, or at least to me, to be able to step out of my comfort zone and speak to people in another language. Now, you're an adult and for any reason, whether work or pleasure, you want to learn a new language. Good news, it's not impossible, and you will be able to learn it well. Bad news, you will have to work harder at it. but with enough passion and drive, you will be able to communicate fluently. Now let's talk to Bill Yanson first. After my conversation with Bill, I will give you my very own list of steps to learn a language. This is a method that has worked for me based on my years of language teaching and my own experience, so stay tuned and stay until the end. Father Bill Yanson was educated at Union College, the University of St. Andrews, the University of Vermont, Middlebury College, and Harvard University, where he pursued advanced graduate studies in classical philology. He has taught a variety of subjects in public schools in 4 different states, had a career in advertising, marketing, and public relations, was on camera television, served as Director of Corporate Communications and Crisis Management for North America for Lufthansa German Airlines, and represented the German government in international business development in the United Kingdom, Poland, the former Soviet Union, the former East German states, and the United States. I have the pleasure of introducing Bill Yanson. He is a Latin and German tutor, and he is also a philologist, and he's going to tell us a little bit about languages from the historical perspective, and he will also give us some practical applications. First, Bill, if you could start by defining philology.
Well, philology, when you're dealing with a culture or culture, especially historically, is the study of the language and linguistics per se, as opposed to archaeology, art and architecture, and so forth.
Excellent. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in this field?
I was fascinated with languages at a very early age. My mom was a kindergarten and second grade teacher, and I can remember before I went to school, her teaching me some little French phrases and so forth. Now, French is a language which I never subsequently studied, but I remember that for my mom, knowing something about another language was a very important thing in one's education. And when I came to have the opportunity in high school, I first started studying Latin. I did 4 years of Latin in high school, and then my final year, my senior year in high school, studied German. The study in high school, though, was just the tip of the iceberg.
So your mom, tell me a little bit about her. How come was she so interested in languages? Did she come from a different country? Tell me more about her.
No, but she was a teacher through and through. I was an only child, and one of the things that she always thought about education, she didn't speak another language. She had been exposed to other languages in this country only, but one of the things she thought about education was that learning a language would be a good thing, and she hoped I did more of it when I went on in school. Little did she know that when I became an undergraduate, I majored in classics, which is, continuation of Latin, as well as ancient Greek. My minor was German. Then after my undergraduate, I did, and this is a mouthful, 2 years in advanced classical philology at Harvard, after which I did a master's degree in classics at the University of Vermont, and then a master's degree in German at Middlebury College. So I've gotten that over with quickly, and now we can move on to things which actually mean something.
No, I'm fascinated, and certainly as a person who loves languages, hearing about someone else who enjoys them as much is fascinating to me. But tell me a little bit about your fluency level in Latin and German.
I speak German. At one period in my life period of about 20 years or so, I spent a lot of time in Germany. I didn't actually live there, but at one point I worked for Lufthansa, the German airline based in New York and Washington, and then also about 2 years after that worked for a a committee, economic branch of the German government based in Berlin, London, Washington, and New York. So I had a great deal of opportunity to speak German, not on a daily, but on a very, very regular basis. The nicest comment I got about my German back in those days was occasionally a German would ask me where I learned my English.
That is one of the greatest compliments. And
yeah. Yeah, I always thought so. For the past 10 years, been a little bit retired. Don't have I still teach German and Latin full time online, but I don't have the occasion in business to travel to Europe as much as I used to. So,
well, we'll talk a little bit about that, about how to keep it up. But certainly, one aspect of language learning and just languages in general that is so appealing to me is that you can only understand a culture. Well, it's not the only way, but it's easier to understand a culture if you understand the language. It has so much information on the culture itself. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And actually, although you really need to be around a language or be exposed to it on the internet or wherever to be exposed to the culture and so forth, I think there's a great deal that a person can benefit from by studying a language and then simply only knowing it in one's own environment, because it's very clear, there's, as you know, being multilingual, there is not a one-to-one correspondence between words in languages.
Correct.
I think it's useful to a person's brain and to a person's way of thinking to realize that when you look at something visually or a relationship or an idea, to see that in another culture, in another language, it might be understood or described slightly differently in words. Mm-hmm. And to me, that lends to a broader understanding of the concept itself.
And what we're touching on here is culture and and the understanding of another person's culture. So let's talk about the United States in particular. It's known for having a majority of population who are monolingual, and inevitably there's some cultural prejudices that happen when you don't speak a different language.
Well, in the United States, that's very, very true. Prior to World War II, the United States was very, very xenophobic. And learning a second language was not necessarily viewed as something that somebody ought to do. Although that brings me to the next step, which is, as you suggested, cultural prejudices with regard to language. Now, I want to be clear to point out to you and your listeners up front that this is not what I believe about languages. But I do believe that in American culture, these observations have a profound effect on how and what languages are learned. Now, traditionally, forever and ever, Latin has been considered the language of lawyers and doctors. Have to learn Latin if you're a lawyer or a doctor. German, among other things, has been considered the language of engineers. French is very often considered the language of literature. And this is the important part where I said this is not what I believe, but I believe it is observable in the culture that many non-Spanish speakers, many people who live in this country and are native English speakers believe that Spanish is the language of landscapers. The reputation of languages in schools, for example, is that Spanish is the easiest and that Latin is the hardest. Well, the way they're taught makes Latin and German the harder and Spanish easier. But I could teach Spanish and make it just as hard as Latin. If you were starting a Spanish 1 course and I sent you home on the first day to memorize several different sets of verbs rather than basic greetings and how to ask directions, you'd find that very, very tough. With Latin, of course, the way it's commonly taught is to send people home to memorize a list of 10 or 15 vocabulary words, memorize a set of grammar rules, and then look at something that's written and say, oh, there it is. Now, this comes to methods of teaching, but with regard to cultural prejudices, I think cultural prejudices in America with regard to different languages influence how they are taught and whether they are made difficult or easier in their teaching.
That's an interesting point. I did not learn languages here in the U.S., so I take that my understanding and the way I was taught languages was very different from the way it is taught here. It is new to me to understand that there are these cultural prejudices against, languages, and particularly, when it pertains to Spanish. And Spanish is widely spoken. I mean, we're talking about all of Latin America, Spain, and it is probably, after Chinese, English, the third most widely spoken language.
Sure. The thing I always like to point out is, if German is the language of science and engineering, what do scientists and engineers in Barcelona speak?
Right.
And that's one of those things where many Americans have a cultural prejudice about languages.
That's right. Well, and it doesn't help to have this very intense political climate at this point.
Exactly, and that's all, in my opinion, that's all part of the cultural baggage, whether it be cultural prejudices, whether that be combined with a certain type of racial prejudice, or whether that be also combined with very, very erroneous misapprehensions about what can do with that language. And I think that's all part of that particular package.
It'd be interesting to see a current survey of what the average American thinks about these languages. But now, in your opinion, and you said that you disagree with this, with that general connotation that it has. But in your opinion, Spanish, what would be if it's not the language of landscapers, what is it to you?
Well, I mean, there's a richness of culture, not only in Latin America, not only in Spain, but also, in many other Spanish-speaking countries around the world. I think very often, and my apologies to Spanish teachers who do not approach it this way. This is completely anecdotal on my part, based on an unscientific sampling. Spanish courses more often want to teach students how to order in a bodega, as opposed to sending people home to memorizing. Whole language and contextual learning of language is very, very, very important. But I think one could take something away from what seems like the inherent rigor of Latin, because the inherent rigor of Latin has nothing to do with Latin. It has to do with the way it's taught. So if we began to teach Latin by reading and deductively instead of inductively, contextually, it would in fact be, quote unquote, easier. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that means, but it would also be much more valuable because, after all, isn't the goal of a Latin course to teach people to read Latin, not to memorize rules about Latin grammar? We've come a long way since the days when every language, including Spanish, including French, including German, including Latin, was taught by the old, what was known as grammar translation method. You had a textbook. The teacher would say, "Okay, go home and memorize these sets of verb endings and memorize this vocabulary. Then we'll have a quiz." So far, you haven't seen any written Latin or Spanish, okay? And then you have a quiz, you have a vocab quiz, and then you have a quiz on the grammar rules, and then the textbook will say, well, let's see how that might be used. And so if you study very, very hard and do very, very well on the quizzes and tests, you will learn a great deal about grammar, very little of which you actually need to know to learn Latin. Now, from there, we moved on, and people my age and a little younger and a little older remember this, the audiolingual method, where show of hands out there in the listening audience, how many learned a language sitting in a language lab, repeating and memorizing dialogues, where the teacher could hear everybody and would go from person to person to person to listen to you and maybe correct individuals as they saw fit. There's some good reasons for the audiolingual method in that it moves beyond grammar translation. The best way to do it, in my opinion, is some form of what's called the direct method, which ranges on the one hand for a spoken language from immersion, or as close as you can get to immersion, to, in the case of Latin, where you're just reading, to jump right in immediately to start reading, to construct the course, to facilitate reading with lots of vocabulary, but reinforce it by reading and not make reading dependent on a whole bunch of grammar rules. So we've kind of, in the last half of the 20th century, first part of the 21st century, we've come a long, long way in our understanding of the best way to learn a language.
Absolutely, and I can tell you that in my experience as a tutor, as an English as a second language tutor, the methodology that we used was to get the students to understand the language in context, but it was divided into grammar, conversation, listening comprehension, and writing. So. But we would make sure that that the time for each was allocated in such way that they could practice in conversation what they had learned from the grammar portion, and so on and so forth. And we saw the best benefits from combining all those four things.
Well, those are the four basic skills of learning a contemporary spoken language. I just come from the school of looking at the reading first and deducing the grammar, rather, kind of by the Socratic method, rather than okay, kids, memorize these rules, and then I'll show you something where they come into play.
And you mentioned something before about immersion, and that is, to me, the key to retention and changing your brain to think in this abstract way where you're not translating in your head. You're going from the concept directly to understanding it. So in terms of immersion, what are the best ways to be immersed in a language if you can't travel to a certain country to learn it that way?
Well, as you just suggested, the best way to learn it is to find somebody you can go stay with in a country for a month and make them promise and you promise not to use any English. And you get by with gestures and pointing and holding up the object and all of that kind of stuff, and that's the way to do it. There are also academically, there are also immersion programs around the country for all ages. One can look up colleges and universities which offer these programs, and you can go for 2 weeks or a month and be immersed. The other thing, of course, is I've always kind of thought this would be fun myself. In a city like Tampa, I would think one could get oneself somewhere where you hear a lot more Spanish than English, and I would think one could contrive to put oneself in that situation a lot. For example, in a program like Rosetta Stone, you learn vocabulary with pictures, not with English. And learning vocabulary with English was only abandoned a few years ago. In some places,
once they crack the code, that's not the way.
and is still being used in some places. That as like in German, Elefant means elephant, or Löwe means lion. Rather than do that, you show a picture of a Löwe, and right away that's a Löwe, not a lion, and that's what it looks like. Everybody knows that when you're a small baby, when you're an infant, is the best time to start to learn a second language. Babies, infants who grow up in Europe speaking 3 languages at once never get them confused. Never. And it has nothing to do with a different individual teaching them one language and then a different individual the other. They just never get them confused because at a very, very early age, there's a linguistic matrix that starts to form in their brain while the brain is still operating cognitively.
You're exactly right.
That is. Yeah, that is to say, you're absorbing material. The brain of an infant is able to, as I said, construct these intuitively construct these individual matrices without even thinking about it. When we become adults, after puberty, and I'm saving the punchline for third, as you can see, after puberty, we are no longer able to do that. We have to acquire languages cognitively. We have to learn languages rather than just be exposed to them. Now, the best way to do that, all other things being equal, is to spend some time 100% in the language. The problem historically, and it continues to be so, with language learning in American education is not that we teach kids languages at a kind of bad time. We teach them at the absolute worst possible time. There is no worse time to learn a language, as well as several other things, but there's no worse time to learn a language than during puberty. Because, and we've only appreciated this within the past, I would say, 10 years, when we've been able to do brain scans and such on people over a period of 30, say, years. We now understand that during puberty, not only do psychochemical changes take place in the brain, but physiological changes take place in the brain. Parts of the brain move. And you tell that to people and they kind of freak out. But other parts of the body move physiologically during puberty, and so does the brain. And this is all part and parcel of the process of blocking off the cognitive areas, the intuitive areas, and changing the brain to an inductive mechanism. Now, don't take my word for it. Go on the internet, Google teen brain, and you will find all kinds of relatively recent studies about this. There's a very well-known one from Sarah Jane Blakemore. You may have heard of it. It's a TED Talk where she talks about the physiological, the actual. It's like tectonic plates moving. They go somewhere else in your noggin. And that accounts for a lot of the general emotional volatility of teens, and a lot of the difficulty that teens have learning a language. It's the absolute worst time to learn a language.
And it's so funny because when I talk to people about languages, or they hear me speak one of the three languages that I speak, they say, well, I took Spanish in high school, but I don't remember anything. If I had $1 bill for every time I hear something like that, it is so true. It's so true. It's the worst time to teach anyone to speak a language for the first time. And they end up not retaining it.
Funnily enough, I have an analog to that. I'll mention Latin, and somebody say, oh, I took 3 years of Latin, and all I remember is amo, amas, amat. And I feel like saying, well, there's a good reason. That's what you were really taught. You weren't taught how to read Latin. Mm-hmm. The whole brass ring was memorization.
It's like counting to 10. I think that's what people retain the most.
Yeah.
But I want to let my listeners know that not all hope is lost if they were not able to learn a language in high school or whatnot. So what are some of the myths that we hear about language learning in adulthood? Well,
some of the myths are you can't really learn a language when you're an adult. That's false. You can learn a language as an adult fairly successfully. People do it all the time, but it's not the same way that you might have learned it as prior to puberty. It is, in fact, a little harder to learn a language conversationally, contextually, and fluently as an adult if you're not plunked right down in the culture somehow. If you're going to next year you're going to need to go to Germany on a 4-week business trip, my guidance would be, okay, look at some stuff on the internet. See what their philosophy of language learning is. And then go 2 weeks early and just get the language in your head and stop thinking about translating. Because as long as you are translating before you speak, you're going to really severely inhibit your ability to learn the language. You've made a shortcut that's really going to inhibit your ability to learn the language more rapidly.
And what can we say about someone who just seems to be interested? There are no plans of going anywhere to become immersed in a culture, in a language, but they want to get started somewhere.
Now the resources available on the internet are enormous. We had nothing like this available. In the old days, there was this whole category which sounds sort of quaintly obsolete, which is things called realia, actual objects. People, I did this because I knew German teachers wanted them. You'd bring back from Germany menus, a real German menu, or a real German magazine, or a real German roadmap. Because that's really the only way you got that stuff, if somebody brought it to you. Whereas now, all of that stuff is available online, in copious amounts, which in the old days not only would be impossible to get all of that stuff in your hands, but it would be prohibitive to travel to all of those different places.
So some people don't know how easy they have it.
They're YouTube and other places, television programs from all kinds of countries. Please don't watch them with subtitles. There are, TVs, movies. Don't watch American movies with German subtitles. Watch German movies or American movies, but with German characters, with German voices and no subtitles. Now, I will say that that's kind of a scary proposition for a grown adult. One of the things that makes it harder for adults to learn a language, other than this cognitive business and intuitive business, is the fact that we embarrass more easily than kids.
That's a good point. Absolutely. Yeah. I think we see that more often, and we see with children. They want to be able to speak perfectly 2 weeks into starting a language, and that's certainly not doable. But they need to understand that that is not expected of them either.
Or 3 years into speaking a language.
Right.
Well, I can't speak perfect Spanish, so I'm not going to speak any at all.
Right. I've talked to so many people that are on that same boat, and they feel like they can't say anything because you're not going to say it with the perfect pronunciation or with perfect grammar.
Yeah, I had this is merely anecdotal, and I am a linguist by training, historical linguist by training. I've only been to Italy once. I will admit that before God and these witnesses. I was there for about 8 days in Rome. Had my wallet stolen, but that's not germane to the story. But I did want to buy an Italian corkscrew. And so I went in a kitchen. Oh, I remember this store vividly. Downtown Rome, a wonderful kitchen supply store. And I found the item, and I picked it up, and I walked over to one of the clerks and pointed at it and made kind of this questioning gesture. And the clerk said to me, "Levatapi, levatapi." And I nodded my head yes and pointed toward the cash register. And we went over there, and I made that other questioning gesture again. And it was an old cash register that the numbers came up. And it probably cost $5, which is at the time probably about 7 trillion lire. But there's an example of a simple transaction, that you can carry on without using the English, and you have communicated. And it's better to have communicated without the English and maybe just 1 or 2 words of Italian than it is to drop right away into English, which the sales clerk probably knew.
Well, as we wrap up we wrap up this interview, I'd like to ask you for your top 3 most important tips for language learning.
Commitment. You really have to want to learn the language. Discipline. Commit yourself to it and stick with it. And for adults particularly, courage. Do not be afraid to make mistakes. I have only been laughed at once when I said something in German, and it really deserved it. It was a hysterical mistake, but I won't go into that. But have the courage to use the language you know and gestures and other stuff to get by. And don't be afraid to sound a lot less smart in the target language than you do in English.
Very good, and I would agree with all of those.
Well, good. I'm glad we're on the same wavelength on that, and I'm not surprised.
Wonderful. Well, just to close this interview, Bill, thank you very much, first of all, for your time and for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise with language.
Well, I'm very, very flattered that you invited me. As you can tell, it's a topic about which I have some passion. In the everyday teaching world, one is more immersed, to use that word, immersed in the learning process with students rather than being able to step back and look at some things theoretically. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to do that. I thank you.
What an interesting interview full of insights on language learning. As promised, here are my steps to learn a new language. Number 1, pick a language you really, really like. I love French because I'm a Francophile and love their culture, love their sound, love their movies. This could be German in your case or Italian for those romantics. Make sure you develop this affection for the other culture first. Check out some of their cool sites and learn about their political and socioeconomic background. It could be just one country that speaks the language. Number 2. For first-time learners, I always suggest a tutor or a class. This will give you a good foundation until you're able to go solo and spread your wings. There are so many sites out there that offer one-on-one lessons over the internet. You don't even have to go anywhere. But if you have the flexibility to physically take classes somewhere around where you live and the budget too, I'd say this is even better. You're committing more of your time and your presence and undivided attention by attending a class. Do number 3. Make sure there is a structure and a methodology, especially when you first start. Make sure that there is a good balance of the 4 pillars of language learning: grammar, conversation, listening comprehension, and writing. None of these has to be stronger than the other. Number 4. Try to avoid the memorization method and the translation method. Make sure your teacher talks to you entirely in the language you'll want to learn, and to explain things to you by using images or concepts. Trust me, you will thank me later. Honestly, what happens here is, picture this as a 2-step process first. Meaning, when you see the picture of a dog, you see the image of a dog or a nice puppy in your head. If you use the translation method, you go from seeing the picture of a dog to translating the word to your language, and then you see the image in your brain. This is a waste of time, and in the long run, you will not be able to remember things. Number 5, don't be afraid to be uncomfortable and to sound strange. It will sound unnatural at first, and that is okay. Also, don't be afraid to exaggerate your pronunciation. This is something that one teacher once told us when I was about 13 or 14 years old. Those in class who didn't commit to exaggerating the pronunciation sound like robots now. Sorry, kids. Number 6, at the beginning, try to have lessons at the very least twice a week. This contact with your teacher will keep you interested and constant. When I used to teach English as a second language, I used to teach an immersion course of 3 hours on weekdays geared towards adults. Can you imagine 3 hours 5 times a week? I shared this course with another teacher. One was focused on grammar and writing, and the other one was the fun one who taught conversation, vocabulary, and listening comprehension. Number 7. When you're not actively learning, be passively learning. For the love of God, listening and singing songs in another language helps, and it helps a lot. That repetition is a good kind of repetition. The key here is that you need to sing. Find the lyrics online and learn it in sections. I do this with new languages. And think about this. Okay, today I will only try to do the chorus, and then the next couple of days I will learn the first verse. I challenge myself with really fast songs. Number 8. If you like to watch movies, you have a great opportunity here. You don't even have to watch a foreign movie. Here's what you can do depending on the language you have chosen to learn. Go ahead and watch your favorite movie in English with subtitles in the target language. That will be your reference. Next time you watch the movie, set it to play dubbed without any subtitles. You'll be surprised to find that you are able to understand most of it. Congratulate yourself. Number 9. Here's what people hate the most, and my guest Bill said. Adults tend to embarrass or feel embarrassed more easily. You have to speak. I call it to produce the language. You have taken in enough. It's time to put everything together and speak. If your course has topics, stay on topic. Or you can always start with who you are and what you do and why you're learning the language. It's like saying your 30-second elevator speech, but in your target language. Number 10, join a meetup group. I used to belong to a library meetup French group. It was a lot of fun and I made lots of friends. If you have the resources, travel to a country and a city where you will be able to apply everything you've learned. If you have constraints with your vacation time, take 10 days and dedicate every single day to being fully immersed in the culture and language. Number 12, enjoy it and don't get frustrated. Well, that was it for this episode. There are many more ways of learning a language, and there are many sites and people who will claim that you can learn a language in 17 days or 30 days. You know yourself, and you know how much time you can dedicate to it, so don't feel like you have to learn quickly. I'd love to hear from you on this topic. Maybe you disagree and have a better methodology. Maybe you don't think it's valuable to learn a new language, in which case you shouldn't have wasted your time listening to my episode. But for those of you who want to start somewhere, please feel free to drop me a line. Thanks for listening. Until next time. Bye.